My parents mocked me for being the dumb one, while my sister got a full scholarship to Harvard. On her birthday, Dad announced she'd inherit everything, including our family's $80 million company, a brand new Tesla, plus the $15 million New York mansion. I sat quietly in the back until a stranger walked in, handed me an envelope, and whispered, "It's time to tell them who you really are." Before diving into the story, I want to thank you for being here and listening. Drop a comment with where you're watching from. I'd love to see how far this story reaches. Hi, my name is Olivia Carter. I am 27 years old. I was born and raised in a wealthy family in Greenwich, Connecticut, where grand old mansions lined the tree-shaded streets, where appearances always had to be spotless while the truth inside was full of cracks. In my parents' eyes, I was never a true daughter. They called me many names, but the one that clung to me throughout my childhood and haunted me well into adulthood was only 2 words: the dumb one. Since I was little, that phrase felt like an invisible label pressed against my forehead, making every effort, every dream of mine fade beneath endless comparisons to my sister. Sophia Carter, my older sister, was the absolute pride of my parents. She was intelligent, talented, and earned a full scholarship to Harvard. Every achievement of hers was celebrated as if it were a triumph for the entire family, while my presence was overlooked like a shadow. I cannot count how many times I tried to raise my hand to speak during family dinners only to be cut off, or when I shared a small accomplishment only to be laughed at. Sophia walked in the light, while I was forced to remain in the darkness behind her. Family dinners in my house always felt like a strict ritual, no different than a staged performance in which I never had a role. The walnut dining table stretched so long it felt as though the distance between me and my parents was an entire world. My father, Richard Carter, always sat at the head of the table, his posture rigid, his cold eyes carrying judgment in every glance. To his right was my mother, Evelyn, who wore a constant polite smile and maintained a flawless exterior, yet her eyes often betrayed disdain whenever they landed on me. To his left was Sophia, the family's golden daughter, who always occupied what was considered the seat of honor. And me, Olivia. I was pushed down to the very end of the table, so far that I had to lean forward just to catch what they were saying. That arrangement was not just a habit, it became a symbol of our place within the family. Sophia at the center, and me forever a shadow at the edge. Dinners always unfolded like a play on repeat. My father would begin by asking Sophia about her day at school, about the achievements he already knew would give her something worth bragging about. My mother chimed in with praises, sometimes exaggerated, as if every A Sophia earned were a Nobel Prize. I sat quietly, waiting for a chance to slip in a small story about myself. But almost every time, just as I opened my mouth, another question was tossed to Sophia, or my father abruptly changed the subject. There were moments when I rehearsed in my head dozens of times how to share something interesting from school, but by the time I got the opportunity to speak, all eyes had already shifted away. My voice echoed into a void no one cared to fill, then faded into silence as if it had never existed. I still remember one moment vividly, when I was 8 years old. I had poured my whole heart into drawing a landscape for an art contest. When my name was announced for first prize, I ran home with the hope my parents would finally be proud of me. I still held the certificate in my hand, the ink fresh and fragrant. But when I placed it on the dining table and eagerly told my story, my father only glanced at it once before saying coldly, "At least you didn't color outside the lines." Then he turned to raise his glass to celebrate Sophia's gold medal in mathematics, and immediately the entire family decided to throw a party for her success. My painting was left behind on the kitchen counter, as forgotten as I was. Events like that repeated so often they became a script I knew by heart. Sophia joined the debate team, and my parents hosted a gathering at the house. Sophia earned a summer scholarship in Europe, and the whole family buzzed with excitement over her bright future. As for me, no matter what I achieved, all I received were comments like, "Not bad" or worse, barbed jokes hidden beneath laughter. Another time, I brought home an essay my teacher praised as creative, and my father did not even bother to read it. He only asked, "Did Sophia score higher?" In their eyes, I was nothing more than a side figure standing next to the perfect equation named Sophia. I learned to stay quiet to avoid ridicule. I stopped raising my hand to show off certificates, stopped telling stories about an interesting day at school. I swallowed even the smallest memories that made me happy, because every attempt to share only meant being interrupted or mocked. Silence became a fragile armor I wore to shield myself from the scrutinizing looks and cold words of my own family. But even as I grew used to it, each small wound still accumulated beneath the surface. I often watched in silence as Sophia was pulled into my parents' arms, showered with sweet words of praise, and wondered if I would ever hear the sentence, "We're proud of you." At night, lying in my small attic room, I imagined a day when my father might sit beside me, listen to me talk about what I loved, about the dreams that had not yet taken shape. But every morning, when I sat down at that long, cold dining table, reality struck me across the face once again. Sophia was celebrated, and I was only reminded that I would never be enough. One winter evening, I remember it as clearly as if it were yesterday. The dining room shimmered with candlelight reflecting off the long wooden table, the clinking of silverware echoing like a lifeless soundtrack. My father, as always, sat upright at the head of the table, his dark suit carrying the stale scent of smoke and heavy liquor. In front of him was a glass of red wine, its surface swirling, his gaze sharp and commanding in a way that kept everyone in the house cautious. Sophia sat at his right, her sleek hair falling gently over her shoulders, her face glowing as she shared a story about a science presentation praised by a Harvard professor. My father listened to every word, nodding with pride, then raised his glass high, his deep voice booming like a decree. "Sophia, you truly deserve to be the future of the Carter family." Those words felt like a knife driven straight into my chest. The entire table burst into applause, laughter filling the room as if they were attending a coronation. I sat at the far end, my chopsticks trembling slightly in my hand, my head lowered so no one would see my eyes begin to glisten. But it didn't end there. My father turned, his cold eyes cutting toward me, and with a half-mocking, half-jeering tone said, "Olivia, at least you didn't fail gym class. We should learn to appreciate the small victories, shouldn't we?" As soon as the words left his mouth, laughter erupted across the table. Sophia giggled, covering her lips like a refined lady, though her eyes still shimmered with disdain. My mother laughed too, a softer laugh, not as loud as the others, but enough to show me clearly she felt no need to defend me. I sat frozen, forcing a crooked smile onto my face, then bowed my head and kept eating as if I had heard nothing. But inside, pieces of my self-respect were being crushed, shattered into 100 fragments. It wasn't only my father. My mother added her own quiet wounds. She never used cruel words, but she planted in my ears comparisons more merciless than any curse. Each time she handed me a plate of food, she would sigh and say, "Why can't you learn your sister's diligence?" When she saw Sophia waking early to study, she would turn to me with a casual tone. "Olivia, if only you tried a little harder, maybe things would be different." These were not shouts or scoldings, but like drops of water falling steadily on stone, day after day, until I felt my sense of worth erode, leaving me nothing more than a silent shadow in my own home. I tried many times to fight back. Once, when my mother said I would never be as hardworking as Sophia, I snapped, "I work at the cafe every day too. I know how to take care of myself." But instead of recognition, my father laughed mockingly. "Oh, serving coffee counts as diligence now? Maybe you should thank Sophia for preserving this family's reputation." My mother stayed silent, her eyes fixed on her plate as if I had just said something foolish. Sophia smiled knowingly, a victory she did not even need to argue for. Those words might have seemed harmless on the surface, but they carved into my mind the feeling that I would never be enough. They planted in me the belief that all my efforts were nothing but a joke to them, that no matter what I did, I would always come second to Sophia, always be seen as the failure. I gradually learned to swallow every emotion, to suppress every reaction, just to avoid becoming the target of the next round of laughter. I stayed quiet, because silence meant fewer wounds. But that silence was not complete surrender. It was more like a shell I built to hide the wounds that grew deeper inside. Every time my father spoke of the future of the Carter family, I felt myself erased from that picture, as if I were an outsider in my own home. Each time my mother compared me, I heard a whisper in my head, "You're not good enough. You're not worthy." And the most terrifying part was that I started to believe it. I believed I really was the dumb one, the useless label they had stamped on me since childhood. Throughout my childhood and into my teenage years, surrounded by cold stares and biting remarks that made me believe I was nothing more than a shadow in the family, there was still one person who truly saw me, understood me, and gave me the sense that I mattered. That was my grandfather, Henry Walsh. He lived in Boston, in an old red brick house with a small garden full of lilacs that bloomed into soft waves of purple each spring. He was the founder of Carter Group, the man who built the empire from nothing, but after retiring he spent most of his time reading, writing in his journals, and tending to his plants. Every time I visited him in Boston, it felt like stepping into a different world, one where I was no longer the dumb one, but simply Olivia, his granddaughter. What made him special was that he never once asked about my grades, whether I was keeping up with Sophia, or how I had made my parents proud. Instead, whenever I sat beside him on the wooden chair on his porch, he would quietly pour me a cup of warm herbal tea and ask in his calm voice, "What do you love, Olivia? How do you want to live?" At first, those questions left me hesitant, because no one in my family had ever cared to ask about my feelings or my dreams. But as I grew familiar with the kindness in his gaze, I began to open up. I told him that I loved painting, that sometimes I imagined opening a small gallery in Brooklyn where people could come to find peace. I told him that I enjoyed listening to others, that I found comfort in empathy, even if no one else saw it as a skill. He nodded, his gentle eyes glowing with genuine joy. "That is who you are," he said. "Not grades, not medals. You have something Sophia doesn't: patience, humility, and the ability to listen. One day, when the time comes, you will understand the true value of those things." His words etched into me like a prophecy. I didn't fully understand them then, but every time I returned to Greenwich and sat once again at the cold far end of the dining table, the memory of his warm voice echoed in my mind like a dim light flickering against the suffocating darkness of disdain. When I was 16, after a heated argument with Sophia about her mocking my part-time job, I ran upstairs, crying uncontrollably, and called my grandfather. Just a few hours later, he drove 2 hours from Boston to our house in Connecticut. He didn't make a scene or scold anyone. He simply knocked gently on my door, sat down beside me, and held my hand. "My dear, never mistake their blindness for the truth," he said slowly. "They don't see you, but that doesn't mean you don't exist. You have something that Sophia and even your parents don't, a heart that knows empathy. And one day, people will realize that you are the one strong enough to carry the weight." I hugged him, feeling my heart ease for the first time. To me, my grandfather was not only the only family member who stood by my side, but also the silent witness to all the pain I endured. He didn't need many words. His presence alone was enough to make me feel I wasn't completely invisible. Trips to Boston became the rare days when I could breathe freely. I remember the mornings he took me walking along the Charles River, pointing out the rowers already out before sunrise, telling me, "They may not be the best, but they are persistent. And persistence is the foundation of victory." I remember the afternoons spent in his small library, when he would take down an old philosophy book, read me a few passages, then ask what I thought. When I hesitantly shared my opinion, he never laughed at me. He simply nodded and said, "You think more deeply than you realize." Those words, simple as they seemed, carried a quiet power that saved me. Thanks to him, I began to believe that I wasn't completely useless. I didn't yet know how to prove myself to the world, but at least I had one person who believed in me. In the years that followed at home, when my father repeated his refrain that Sophia is the future of the family, and when my mother dropped another comparison that pierced my chest, I silently recalled my grandfather's image, his voice reminding me that I carried qualities they would never see. That memory kept me from collapsing entirely, preserving a fragile hope that one day his words would come true. By the time I turned 16, the gap between Sophia and me was no longer just about praise or criticism at the dinner table. It had become a chasm impossible to fill. My father began taking Sophia with him to Carter Group's board meetings, the company he proudly called the family's empire. I remember mornings when the sun was just rising over the tree-lined streets of Greenwich, and the black luxury car would already be waiting at the gate. Sophia, dressed impeccably, would climb into the car with my father, her eyes glowing with pride. From the attic window, I watched their figures disappear down the paved road, my heart swelling with the ache of being left behind, like an unnecessary object in the family's grand portrait. While Sophia was guided step by my father to become his successor, I was left with the tasks no one wanted. My mother told me to clean the living room before guests arrived, reminding me over and over. At least you should help keep the house tidy, so people won't think we have a lazy daughter. When the company held events, Sophia wore elegant gowns and stood beside my parents in photos that appeared in business papers, while I was sent to buy extra bottles of wine, prepare cold towels, or clean up the mess after everyone left. Even while living in the same house, I felt like a guest, someone present but never considered a true part of the family. I knew I could not wait for recognition from them, so I searched for ways to take care of myself. I took a morning shift at a small cafe near school, starting at 6 a.m., where the smell of roasted beans and the clatter of grinders became familiar sounds. In the afternoons, I worked at a supermarket, stocking shelves until my arms ached. Every small paycheck I earned, I carefully tucked into a savings account for college because I knew my parents would never support me the way they did Sophia. To them, Sophia was worthy of every investment, while I was not worth the expense. During those long, exhausting days, what hurt me most was not the aching legs or the cracked hands, but coming home. Every time I opened the door, my hair still carrying the scent of coffee or my clothes marked with the smell of groceries, Sophia would give me a half smile and say mockingly, "Make sure you wash up, Olivia," or Carter Group's clients might catch a whiff of grease and we'd all be embarrassed. Her words felt like a slap. But what hurt more was that my parents never defended me. They never corrected Sophia. Instead, they laughed along, treating it like a harmless joke. "She's right, Olivia," my mother added. "You should keep up the family's image, at least while you're still living here." I swallowed hard, forcing down the lump in my throat, reminding myself that any reaction would only give them more reason to ridicule me. The older Sophia grew, the more she stepped into my parents' world, while I was pushed further away. I remember one time Sophia accompanied my father to a conference in New York, surrounded by investors and prominent politicians. I overheard my father on the phone with a friend, saying, "Sophia is only 16 and already understands how the company works. She is the jewel of my family." I stood just outside the door, only a few steps away, but in those words I realized I never had a place. I was not my father's daughter in any way he was proud of. I was only the extra name that existed to be measured against Sophia's perfection. Each day, I felt as though I were living two separate lives. One life existed in my family's eyes, useless, lazy, always inferior. And the other life was the one I struggled to build outside, an independent girl, working hard to keep her small dreams alive. Only my grandfather Henry ever saw me the second way, but he lived far away in Boston, and I could not always turn to him. Most of the time, I had to endure alone in that vast but cold house. The distance between Sophia and me grew clearer with each passing year, not just in where we sat at the dinner table or in family photos, but in how everyone treated us. Sophia was seen as the center of the universe, while I was like a small planet orbiting quietly on the outside, my existence unnoticed. And that distance stirred a storm inside me, a silent urge that one day I had to step out of the shadows, no matter what it took. In the days leading up to Sophia's 24th birthday, the Carter house in Greenwich transformed into a bustling construction site. My mother barely slept, rushing from calls to a Manhattan florist to endless revisions of the menu with the hotel chef, her voice echoing through the halls in a constant flurry. The landline rang nonstop, her high heels striking against the marble floors like pounding drums, while staff hurried back and forth with boxes of gifts, bottles of wine, and table linens. My father was just as busy, though his busyness carried the weight of power. Phone calls with shareholders, instructions to the company's media team, and discreet meetings with reporters to ensure that Sophia's birthday would not simply be a party, but a public declaration his daughter was the heir. In that whirlwind of preparation, I was nothing more than a faint shadow blending into the backdrop. No one asked what I thought, and no one cared what I might wear. The only task my mother handed me was a thick stack of seating charts. "Don't mess this up, Olivia," she stressed, pressing the papers into my hands. "This guest has to sit next to that official. This investor must be placed at the same table with the Harvard board member. Do you understand?" I nodded, though I knew perfectly well that my role at the party would be limited to making sure everyone else sat in the right place, while I remained at the far back row, where no light would ever reach. That day, my mother took Sophia to try on dresses on Fifth Avenue. The fitting room glittered with shimmering gowns, and the sales associates flattered her as if she were a Hollywood star. I stood outside, arms crossed, waiting silently for hours. No one thought of picking out a dress for me. When I finally let slip, "What about me?" my mother gave me a quick glance and brushed me off. "You can wear the blue dress from last year. No need to draw attention, Olivia." I bit my lip and said nothing more. The truth was, that dress was old, the zipper caught a little, and the fabric had lost its sheen. But in their eyes, I was never meant to stand out in any photograph. I remember the night before the party, standing quietly in front of the mirror, slipping into that faded blue dress. It pinched at the chest and hung loose at the waist, making me look awkward. I turned, staring at my reflection, and asked myself, would anyone notice me tomorrow, or would I just be a blur in the background of the frame? The answer was painfully clear. I drew in a deep breath and reminded myself to be ready, because tomorrow would only be another familiar performance. Sophia at the center, my parents applauding her, while I sat quietly, the target of casual ridicule. On the morning of the party, the whole family headed to Manhattan. A long limousine waited at the door, the driver in a black suit holding the door open as my parents and Sophia stepped inside. I quietly adjusted my dress and slipped into the back row of seats. Sophia glowed in her brand new gown, the crystal neckline sparkling, her smile wide as if the entire world revolved around her. My parents fussed over her, straightening her father's tie, coaching her on greetings and handshakes, while I sat in silence, staring out the window at the familiar streets I once walked to my part-time jobs. The contrast made me feel like an outsider who had mistakenly boarded the car of a family that never truly considered me one of them. When we arrived at the hotel, the sight nearly overwhelmed me. Chandeliers poured down golden light across the gilded lobby, hundreds of staff hurried about arranging tables, and the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume. I was handed a seating chart and told to check every place card to make sure guests sat exactly where they were supposed to. No one asked if I had eaten or if I needed a break. I was simply another cog in the machinery, a small, replaceable part, and most of all, a figure destined to be hidden in the day's grand picture. Music swelled as the great doors to the ballroom opened, revealing a space drenched in crystal light. From my place at the very back, I could see the entire room like a glittering stage. Guests streamed in. Renowned business figures I had only ever seen in the news, polished politicians in tailored suits, and Sophia's Harvard friends, each one radiating the effortless confidence of people born to be celebrated. Laughter rippled through the air, glasses clinked in rhythm, and together they painted a portrait of extravagance one I knew I would never belong to. Sophia stood at the center, like a star blazing against a dark sky. Her crystal-studded gown caught the light, turning each step she took into a performance. Guests crowded around to congratulate her, shaking hands, embracing her, as if this were not merely the birthday of a 24-year-old woman, but a historic event in New York's elite circles. I sat still, my hands clenched tightly in my lap, trying not to let myself feel misplaced. Every time I lifted my eyes, I caught Sophia's mocking glance, a look that reminded me I was nothing more than a side character in her grand story. The climax of the evening came when my father, Richard Carter, walked onto the stage. He wore a flawless black tuxedo, his face glowing with pride. My mother accompanied him, her arm linked with his, her smile radiant as if her entire life had led to this moment. When the microphone was handed over, the entire ballroom fell silent, every gaze fixed on him. My father cleared his throat, raised his glass, and spoke in his deep, commanding voice. Ladies and gentlemen, today is not only my daughter Sophia's birthday, it is also the moment to announce to all our friends, partners, and family. Sophia Carter will be the sole and rightful heir of the Carter legacy. A ripple of whispers swept through the crowd. I swallowed hard, my heart pounding. My father pressed on, his voice growing even more triumphant. Carter Group, valued at $80 million, the $15 million mansion on the Upper East Side, along with a brand new Tesla, all of it will belong to our perfect daughter. Sophia is our pride, the proof of this family's brilliant future. The moment his words ended, the ballroom erupted in thunderous applause. Cheers and the clinking of glasses echoed endlessly, making me feel as though the entire room was trembling. Sophia stepped forward, her lips curved into a satisfied smile. She turned toward me, her eyes sweeping past with a look of challenge, as if carving into my heart a cruel truth. You've lost. You were never chosen. I sat frozen, forcing myself to breathe evenly. My chest tightened as if squeezed in a vice, each word from my father slicing deeper into old wounds. Then I heard my mother's voice, soft but sharp enough to cut. Olivia, don't ruin your sister's special day. I turned and saw her still smiling radiantly, though her cold eyes brushed past me like a warning. Amid the grandeur, I felt like a misplaced shadow. No one looked at me, no one mentioned me. I saw my reflection faintly mirrored in the crystal panels at the back of the room. The faded blue dress, my hunched posture, my eyes glistening as I fought back tears. While Sophia stood radiant, basking in applause like a queen being crowned, I was left with the suffocating weight of humiliation pressing against my chest. In that moment, my grandfather Henry's words came back to me. You have things Sophia does not. One day, when the time comes, you will understand. But right then, I saw no light. I only felt myself pushed deeper into the shadows, nailed into the role of the loser before a cheering crowd. I could not have imagined that on this very night, beneath the roar of applause, everything was about to change. But in that instant, all I could do was sit still, biting my lip, bracing myself for yet another round of public humiliation. The music in the ballroom pulsed on, the chatter and clinking of glasses swirling together into a noisy whirlwind that swallowed every pause. I sat still, trying to make myself look like part of the decor, no different from the empty chair tucked in the back. Sophia gleamed at the center of attention, basking in endless congratulations. My father continued his speech about the vision of the Carter legacy, while my mother clung to his arm, her face radiant with pride. I knew well that I had no place in that picture. That's why, when a man in a black suit stepped out from the crowd and walked straight toward me, I almost couldn't believe my eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, moving with a steady confidence, his stern face free of the polite smiles that plastered the other guests. His eyes were sharp and cold, locked on me as if the entire ballroom had vanished, leaving only the two of us. The steady thud of his leather shoes echoed across the wooden floor, briefly drowning out the soft music. I lifted my head, my heartbeat racing, breath caught in my chest. No one else noticed him, their eyes fixed on Sophia. He stopped in front of my table, set down a thick white envelope, and leaned close, his voice low and gravelly but certain. It's time. I froze. Those words reverberated through my mind, sounding less like a message and more like a command. My hand trembled as I touched the envelope, feeling its weight and stiffness, as if it carried something far heavier than ordinary papers. I quickly slid it into my lap, hiding it under the table, terrified that my parents or Sophia might catch sight of it. Sweat beaded on my forehead, even as the air conditioning kept the room cool. I looked up, ready to ask something, but the man had already straightened, giving me a subtle nod as if to seal the moment, then turned and walked away. His steps merged into the crowd, swallowed by the sea of guests, and within seconds he was gone. I sat frozen, my heart pounding so violently it felt as though the entire room could hear it. I glanced around, but no one was paying attention to me. Glasses were still being raised, laughter still ringing, all for Sophia. No one noticed the envelope that had landed before me like a bolt of lightning splitting the night sky. I laid my other hand over the envelope, tracing its sharp edges. A part of me wanted to tear it open immediately, but another part trembled with fear. 1,000 questions crashed through my mind. What's inside? Why me? Who sent him? I thought of my grandfather Henry, of his stern yet trusting gaze. A thought flickered. Could this be what he meant, that one day the time would come? I sat as still as stone, clutching the envelope, my heartbeat hammering against my chest. No one in the ballroom cared about me. Every eye remained fixed on Sophia and my parents. That gave me a strange illusion of safety, as though I had been given a pocket of air to breathe in the storm around me. My fingers shook as I slipped them under the flap and slowly tore it open. The sound of ripping paper was faint, but to me it roared inside my chest. I pulled out a thick stack of documents with firm, embossed edges, stamped with the familiar Carter Group logo and a deep blue legal seal. My eyes darted across the first lines, widening, my throat tightening. On that white page, the name printed was not Sophia's, as I had always assumed, but mine. Olivia Grace Carter. Below it, bold lines confirmed my legal ownership of more than 51% of Carter Group shares, along with a detailed list of trust accounts in my name and inheritance documents for the Upper East Side mansion. I read the lines over and over, afraid my eyes were deceiving me. My heart pounded so fast it felt ready to burst from my chest. I turned a few more pages. Each document bore official seals, legal signatures, and at the top of the final page was the tremblingly familiar name, Henry Walsh. My grandfather. His handwriting was sharp yet steady, the strokes firm as if to erase any trace of doubt. My throat went dry, and I had to swallow several times before I could breathe evenly again. Tucked behind the stack of papers was a handwritten letter, neatly folded. The paper had yellowed slightly with age, carrying the faint scent of old ink and a hint of herbal tea. I recognized instantly it was his. My hands shook as I opened the letter. The careful strokes came alive on the page, like his voice whispering directly into my ear. Olivia, if you are reading these words, it means the time has come. I have watched both you and your sister grow. Sophia has intelligence and sharpness, but within her lies a pride that too easily turns into arrogance. Your father, Richard, built wealth, but in doing so, he lost compassion and allowed ambition to eclipse love. You, Olivia. You grew up in shadows, in silence, but that silence forged in you a strength they will never have. You know humility, you understand the value of listening, and you know how to rise even when pressed to the very bottom. Those are the true qualities of a leader. Everything I built, I place in your hands. The future of this family belongs to you. I read every word, my vision blurred with tears. 1,000 memories flooded back, afternoons sitting on my grandfather's porch in Boston, his gentle questions, what do you love, how do you want to live? All piecing together into a single, vivid picture. He hadn't only comforted me with words. He had been preparing me all along, quietly but deliberately, so that today, in the very moment the world saw me as nothing but a shadow, he placed in my hands the brightest light. I bit my lip, holding back sobs. In my head echoed Sophia's mocking laugh, my father's jeers, my mother's cold comparisons. For years they branded me, the dumb one, turning me into the family's punchline, even at the dinner table. Yet here in my hands lay undeniable proof of the opposite. My grandfather had never been blind. He had seen me, seen the smallest things, and entrusted me with everything. Pressing the letter against my chest, I closed my eyes. For the first time in my life, I felt seen, acknowledged. The pain of all those years broke open, not in bitterness, but in a new kind of faith. I was no longer Olivia, the girl at the end of the table, wearing an old dress, dismissed and belittled. I was Olivia, the one Henry Walsh had chosen to carry forward his legacy. I drew in a deep breath, letting the strength of his words fill every corner of my being. Outside, the music still played, the applause still thundered, Sophia still stood on stage soaking in the praise. No one knew that in the far corner of the room, the entire balance of power had quietly shifted. I looked down at the documents, then raised my head, my gaze steadier than it had ever been. I understood that the moment of confrontation would come, and this time, I would not be silent. The music still poured down like a waterfall of light, but inside me, another kind of silence was rising, the silence of decision. I folded the letter, slipped it back into the stack of papers, and laid my hand over it as though pressing against the very beat of my own heart. Then I stood. The chair scraped lightly against the wooden floor, a small sound that in my mind rang like a bell. I walked along the aisle between tables, past the white drapes, past the crystal glasses trembling with reflections, past the eyes that still failed to register my presence. Each step felt like treading over the years of being dismissed. The long, cold dinners, the laughter at least you didn't fail, Jim, the sneers about washing my hands because of the smell of grease. I drew in a deep breath and placed my foot on the first step leading up to the stage. My heart pounded, but my breath was steady. I knew what I was about to do. And I knew that after this moment, I would never be the same again. My father was raising his glass, the spotlight catching his face and sharpening his victorious smile. As I reached the podium, a few nearby guests turned in surprise. I set the folder of documents on the lectern, pressing my palm against it to feel its weight, then drew the microphone close to my lips. "This moment belongs to me," I said, my voice low at first but unwavering. The words sliced through the music like a blade. The entire ballroom jolted in shock. Whispers erupted instantly, spreading like sparks racing across a dry field. My father snapped around, his eyes instantly darkening. "Olivia, get down this instant," he growled, his voice low but sharp as a whip. "Don't disgrace this family in front of my friends." I looked straight at him, and what I saw wasn't worry, it was fury, because the order he had ruled over for so long was being broken, and by me. At last, I had learned not to flinch beneath that stare. I lifted the folder high, angling it so the lights caught the bold blue seal. "Grandfather Henry signed this transfer legally," I said, enunciating each word. "The majority shares of Carter Group, the trust accounts, the deed to the mansion, all of it is under my name. And this letter, in his own hand, declares that the future of this family belongs to me." A wave of commotion rippled through the crowd. Guests in the front rows shot up from their seats, glasses tipped, crystal chiming faintly as they collided. I caught a senator frowning, an investor who had been laughing suddenly sobering, and a journalist half-raising his camera before lowering it again, unsure if this was a staged performance or an actual detonation. Sophia rushed to the edge of the stage, her face pale under the lights, her eyes wide with disbelief. "No, that's impossible," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I'm the one who deserves it." Her words ricocheted against the crystal ceiling, harsh and jarring. I turned to her, meeting her gaze. "Deserving doesn't come from applause," I replied, my voice calmer than I ever imagined it could be. "Grandfather saw what even you could not: humility, patience, and the ability to listen. Those are what have kept this family from rotting from the inside out." My father stepped closer, his fist tightening, veins standing out along his neck. "Give it to me," he hissed through clenched teeth. "Don't turn your sister's birthday into a circus." He lunged to snatch the documents, but I was quicker. I pulled out the letter, unfolded it wide, and read aloud beneath the lights. "Olivia, if you are reading these words, it means the time has come. I place in your hands everything I have built. The future of this family belongs to you." Each word I spoke drove another nail into the coffin of the lies that had weighed on me for so long. I heard faint gasps, sharp intakes of breath, and felt the entire room tilt toward the truth now laid bare. My mother clutched my father's arm tightly, but not before casting me a blazing look. "Olivia, what are you doing? You'll ruin everything." I lowered the letter and looked at her. You call it everything, the very same everything that always excluded me? My voice was soft, but years of pent-up emotion surged through every syllable. I've sat at the end of the table for 27 years. Tonight, I'm only standing where I should have been all along. Sophia snatched a microphone from an attendant, her voice shaking with rage. You think a few pieces of paper can change everything? I've worked tirelessly. I've brought honor to this family. I locked my gaze on hers, unblinking. You've worked for the spotlight, I answered evenly. Grandfather taught me to work for those standing in the shadows. A faint cough echoed from the far end of the hall. Then a tall figure appeared, cane in hand, moving slowly but with certainty. The entire ballroom turned to look. I recognized the walk before I even saw the face, Henry Walsh. He said nothing at first. He simply walked, each step deliberate, down the aisle lined with overflowing wine glasses and white drapes, until he stood beside me. The lights poured down on his slightly stooped but unyielding frame, and in that instant, I felt everything snapping back into its rightful place. He placed a hand on my shoulder, light, yet steady. Then he turned his gaze squarely on Richard, his son-in-law, and spoke in a voice deep and resonant. I know what I signed, Richard. And I know why I signed it. The words were simple, but they landed like a verdict. He inclined his head toward Sophia, his eyes not condemning, but holding up a mirror before her. Sophia has talent, but talent without discipline and humility will soon collapse into arrogance. No. Then his gaze shifted back to my father, and this time his tone hardened, a line drawn straight and unbending. Richard, you built wealth, but in the process you abandoned people. You let the family's prestige become a wall that shut out compassion. Carter Group cannot be just a balance sheet. It must be about people who trust one another. His hands squeezed my shoulder gently, as if stamping his final seal. Olivia is the one who understands the true value of Carter Group. Oh! For several seconds, the ballroom was utterly silent. I could hear the faint breath of the air conditioner above and feel the pulse thudding at my own wrist. Those who had laughed so loudly earlier now glanced at one another, uneasy, as though realizing they had been standing on the wrong side. A fund manager leaned forward, his eyes lit with the gleam of someone who had just spotted a long-term opportunity. A Harvard professor furrowed his brow, then gave the slightest nod, like completing a difficult proof. My mother slipped her hand from my father's arm, her smile frozen half-formed. Sophia stood motionless, her hands gripping the edge of the table, her crystal gown scattering 100 fractured lights as though draining from her face. And my father, his jaw set, the authority that had once dominated every room suddenly powerless. The applause came slowly at first, tentative claps tapping the silence like someone testing fragile ice. Then it grew, heavier, louder, crashing together in an unbroken rhythm. I felt the shift in the air, like a wind turning in an instant. People rose to their feet, others leaned across tables to see me more clearly. I noticed young employees, those who had always stood at the edges of these gatherings, clapping harder than anyone, their eyes shining in a deeply human way. I did not feel triumph. I only felt lightness, as though someone had finally loosened the knot in my chest that had been pulled tight for years. My father suddenly lifted his napkin from the table, folded it with an angry precision, then tossed it onto his chair. My mother lowered her head and followed him, her heels striking the floor in hurried, staccato beats. They strode quickly out of the ballroom, the doors swinging open to let a draft of cold air sweep in before closing again, leaving behind the faint sigh of someone seated near the entrance. Sophia did not leave. She stood frozen, her wide eyes fixed on me as though staring at a new order she hadn't yet learned how to exist within. Grandfather, she murmured, her voice small, like someone lost returning to the only landmark they knew. Henry turned to her, his gaze neither rejecting nor indulgent. Sophia, he said slowly, you have the talent to do great things. But greatness always begins with the small ways we treat people, even your own sister. If you wish to walk a long path, learn how to bow before the truth. Her teeth pressed against her lip, her fingers slipping from the edge of the table, her chin trembling faintly, but no words escaped. My grandfather turned back to the microphone, his voice now carrying to the entire room. From tonight onward, Carter Group will return to the purpose it was founded upon: to create dignified jobs, to conduct business with integrity, and to place human values on the same table as profit. Those who stand with us for these principles, stay. For those who only seek applause, the doors are not locked. Amen. A low hum of approval rose from the corner where an older businesswoman stood, lifting her glass toward us as a pledge. Others followed, nodding in unison, their agreement spreading across the tables like dominoes tipping one into the next. And in that moment, I knew the invisible network that determined the fate of a company had shifted. Henry leaned close to my ear, his voice low enough for only me to hear. "You don't need to be like me, you only need to hold on to what I've seen in you." His words pulled me out of the daze of all the eyes fixed on me. I filled my lungs with air and nodded. Then I stepped to the microphone, not to add more accusations, not to strike anyone down, but simply to reset the rhythm of the room. "Thank you all for listening," I said, my voice steady now. "I know tonight hasn't been comfortable for many of us. But truth is rarely comfortable. Starting tomorrow, if you choose to stay, we'll begin by meeting the team, opening the books, and listening. I believe a strong company is built more from honest questions than from polished answers." More applause rose, not the applause for a show, but for a promise that could be measured. Sophia stepped forward, the sound of her shoes on the floor like a small signal asking for space to speak. I turned to her, neither defensive nor combative. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, as if the familiar words, deserve, position, tradition, had crumbled on her tongue. At last, she whispered so softly it seemed meant only for herself. "You were there all along." I nodded. "And you can be here," I replied, "if you're willing to start by looking straight." There was no applause this time. Only a gentle, good silence that wrapped around us for a moment, a silence my family had never allowed before. A human resources manager stepped forward, introducing himself, saying the staff had been waiting for this shift toward listening for a long time. A young employee, the same girl who had once been cut from a project for not having the right connections, came closer, whispering, "Thank you," her eyes rimmed with tears, as if receiving an apology on behalf of the entire system. And I realized then that tonight's story had stretched far beyond the bloodlines of my family. It had reached those who had long been seated at the end of the table in more ways than one. As the orchestra shifted into a slower piece, the atmosphere eased. Henry lifted a glass of water, no longer drinking wine, and guided me down from the stage. He said he needed to sit for a while, resting his cane beside the chair. I sat with him, the two of us tucked into a corner near the tall windows that overlooked the glowing avenue. "You just made it through the hardest moment," he said, his eyes tired yet warm with a smile. "The rest won't be easy. But hard doesn't mean wrong." I answered, "I know, and I won't walk it alone." He nodded. "No. You have those who clapped at the right moment for the right reason, not because of the titles on their cards, but because of what they believe in." Far across the hall, the doors where my parents had left remained shut. I felt no triumph in recalling my father's flushed face or my mother's shattered smile. What I felt was a sadness finally named and then released. I knew there would still be difficult conversations, letters from lawyers, speculative headlines. But just as Henry had said, hard does not mean wrong. And what is right, once spoken with kindness, always finds a way to stand firm. As the guests gradually dispersed, some came to shake my hand, brief but sincere. The chandeliers dimmed a notch, scattering faint star-like reflections across the polished wood floors. Sophia was still there, perched on the edge of an empty chair, her eyes stripped of their old fire of pride. I did not approach, but I left the door open with a simple nod. Her journey, like mine, perhaps was only just beginning again. Henry rose gently, tapping his cane against the floor, signaling it was time to leave this room behind. I took his arm, and together we walked past the very last row of seats where just an hour earlier I had sat clutching the envelope as if it were a secret I could never share. Now, that secret had been spoken aloud. What remained was not applause, but a strange, quiet steadiness in my chest. The ballroom doors closed behind me, sealing away the music, the laughter, the noise beneath thick walls. I stepped into the hotel lobby, and the night air of New York rushed in car exhaust, the scent of coffee from the corner cafe, neon lights spilling across rain-slicked streets. I tilted my head back to the sky, the skyscrapers stretching upward, glittering with light. It felt as though the whole world had opened before me, no longer hemmed in by invisible walls that once pinned me to the end of a dining table. No longer diminished by the eyes that measured me against someone else. For the first time in years, I felt myself standing squarely at the center of my own life. Grandfather Henry stepped slowly behind me, his cane tapping steadily against the marble floor. He stopped at my side, lifting his gaze to the city's brilliance. "Now you see, don't you?" he asked, his voice low but strong enough to drown out the chaos outside. I turned, meeting his eyes, the same eyes that had been my only anchor through childhood. He rested his hand on my shoulder, old yet steady, and continued, "Carry this with you, and use it well. Not for revenge, not to prove them wrong, but to live true to yourself, and to build what you know is right." I nodded, my eyes stinging. All those years I had waited for my parents' acknowledgement, for a word of praise, for a warm glance suddenly revealed themselves as a pointless vigil. I understood now. I did not need them. I had never truly needed them. My worth was never bound to the labels they had slapped on me, the dumb one. Tonight, I had torn that label off and cast it away, not because they handed me a new one, but because I finally saw that I had never worn it at all. I closed my eyes, inhaling deeply until my lungs filled. The sounds of New York honking horns, bursts of laughter, the tap of shoes on the sidewalk suddenly became a soundtrack of freedom. I remembered the nights I worked late at the cafe, my hands stained with the smell of burnt coffee beans, my clothes heavy with grease, while Sophia returned from trips across Europe with suitcases of designer brands. I remembered the times my mother looked at me and sighed, "Why can't you be more like your sister?" I remembered my father's booming laugh. "At least you didn't fail gym class." All of those things that once seemed to define me were now nothing more than fragments. I turned to my grandfather and said softly, "I used to think I had to fight just to be seen by them. But now I understand I don't need their eyes on me. I only need to believe that I am worthy." He smiled, his face lined with age but glowing with light. "Exactly. That's all I ever wanted, for you to see it yourself, and now you do." We sat in silence, watching the traffic stream down the avenue. I thought of Sophia, of her stunned eyes, the tremble at her lips when she heard the truth. I didn't hate her, I only felt pity. Pity for the illusion she had been raised in that the light belonged to only one person. I thought of my parents, their flushed faces, their anger and shame forcing them out of that ballroom. I knew they would return, with accusations, with resistance, but that no longer frightened me. Because from now on, I was no longer the child sitting silently at the end of the table, waiting for crumbs of affection. I stepped down the marble stairs of the hotel and into the rush of Manhattan's crowd. The city did not know who I was, nor did it care that I had been called the dumb one for years. Yet it stretched wide before me, as if whispering, "Every road is open, if you have the courage to walk it." I felt each step strike against the cold pavement, but my heart glowed with a warmth I had never known before. That night, I returned to my small apartment in Brooklyn, the one I had rented with my own earnings, where every corner carried the mark of my own effort. I sat at the table, spread out the documents, and read my grandfather's letter once more. Each word, each stroke of ink felt like a reminder. You were never worthless. You only needed the right moment to prove it to yourself. I switched on the desk lamp, opened a fresh notebook, and wrote on the very first page. From this day on, I will not live to be recognized. I will live to build, to love, and to become the truest version of myself. I closed the notebook and set it down, feeling lighter, as though I had laid aside the weight that had pressed on me for 27 years. Outside the window, New York's lights shimmered, reflecting across the East River like thousands of fallen stars. I whispered, as if to anyone out there who had ever been belittled, ever branded unworthy. Your value does not lie in the labels others put on you, but in the resilience you build. One day, the truth will rise, and when it does, you will see you are never without worth. I smiled softly and closed my eyes. Amid the roar of a city that never sleeps, I heard the sound of my own heartbeat steady, free, and for the first time, untethered from anyone else. Tonight, I was no longer a shadow. I was Olivia Carter, and I had found myself again.